Fluorescent lights in the detective's office flickered with nauseating regularity, casting a cold glow on my haggard face. Detective Miller sat opposite me, his eyes scrutinizing every wrinkle on my face, every movement of my trembling hands. I knew I looked like a madman, disheveled hair, sunken eyes still wet with tears, clothes stained with my family's blood. But I didn't care. I needed to tell this story, even if no one believed it, especially if no one believed it. I cleared my throat, trying to gather the last remnants of my voice, hoarse from screaming and sobbing. The detective turned on his recorder, and the soft whirring of the device filled the silence of the office. I began to speak, and the words poured out of me like blood from an unstoppable wound. It all started 3 years ago, when I still believed that money could solve any problem. Back then, I worked as a warehouse loader, earning next to nothing, and my wife, Sarah, would count and recount our meager savings every evening, trying to figure out if we had enough to last the month. Our son, Alex, who had just turned 8, wore hand-me-down clothes and dreamed of a bicycle we could never afford. Our daughter, Lily, a 5-year-old princess with golden curls, asked for a doll for her birthday. But we knew the most we could manage was a homemade rag doll. Every morning I woke with a heavy heart, knowing I wouldn't be able to give my family what they deserved. Sarah worked as a nurse at the local community clinic, but even our combined incomes barely covered rent and food. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town, where the roof constantly leaked and the radiators barely heated in winter, forcing the kids to sleep in hats and coats. I remember that evening especially clearly. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, hunched over a calculator, her face tense with concentration. The numbers, as usual, weren't adding up. We owed money for utilities for Lily's daycare, and payday was still 2 weeks away. Alex was doing his homework by the dim light of a desk lamp, and Lily was playing with her few toys on the worn carpet. In that moment, I made a vow to myself, a vow that would later become a curse for my entire family. I swore I would do anything to change our lives at any cost. Those words, at any cost, would echo in my mind for the rest of the days I had left to live. The following months turned into an endless series of attempts to find a better job. I quit one place and started another, hoping to strike gold. I worked as a night security guard, then a taxi driver, tried selling goods at the flea market, even dabbled in multi-level marketing. But each time something went wrong. Either the company turned out to be a scam, or the boss was a tyrant, or I simply lacked the initial capital to get a business off the ground. Sarah tried to support me, but I saw how hope faded in her eyes with each of my failures. The children got used to Dad being constantly stressed and often absent, trying to earn a better future for them. Alex stopped asking for a bike, and Lily no longer mentioned the doll. The children's silence hurt me more than any reproach. The winter months were particularly difficult. Our apartment was poorly heated, and we economized on everything, including food. Sarah learned to cook hearty meals from the cheapest ingredients, but I saw her eat less herself, leaving larger portions for the children. At night, when the family slept, I lay awake and listened to the floorboards creak above us, the pipes hum in the walls, and some stranger's baby cry somewhere. And in those moments, such despair would overwhelm me that I wanted to scream. I began to notice I was changing. The constant stress and failures made me irritable and gloomy. Sometimes I snapped at the children for no reason, then tormented myself with guilt for hours. Sarah tried to talk to me, but I would shut down, believing that no one could understand the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. On one particularly hard day, when we were warned about our electricity being shut off for non-payment, and Lily got sick and needed money for medicine, I hit rock bottom. Sitting in the kitchen late at night when everyone else was asleep, I first thought that perhaps my family would be happier without me. Maybe Sarah would find someone more successful, and the children would get a stepfather who could provide them with a decent life. These thoughts terrified me, but I couldn't shake them. I started drinking in the evenings, just a little at first, to drown out the voices in my head constantly telling me of my failures. Sarah noticed, but she didn't dare say anything, seeing the state I was in. Jobs came and went. I tried construction, but after a month, the construction company went bankrupt and we weren't paid. I got a job as a salesman in an electronics store, but failed my probation due to a conflict with the manager. I tried fixing computers from home, but clients were scarce and competition was fierce. With each failure, I became more convinced that some higher power was working against me. It felt like the whole world had conspired to keep me from escaping poverty. Friends started avoiding me, tired of my constant complaints and requests for loans. Sarah's parents openly expressed their displeasure that their daughter had married a loser. The most painful moment was when we couldn't throw a birthday party for Alex. Other kids in his class received expensive gifts, celebrated at arcades or at home with entertainers, but all we could afford was a homemade cake and a few balloons. Alex didn't complain, but I saw the disappointment in his eyes and it broke my heart. Sarah said then that the kids didn't need expensive gifts. What mattered was family love. But I knew she was just trying to comfort me. At school, kids are cruel to those who are different, and our poverty made my children outcasts. Alex started to be ashamed to invite friends home, and Lily cried when she saw other girls with pretty dresses and toys. It was during that period when my faith in the possibility of changing my life for the better had almost vanished, that an event occurred that turned everything upside down. On a rainy October day, when I returned from another unsuccessful job interview, soaked and defeated, Sarah met me with a letter in her hands. The envelope was thick, expensive, with the seal of some law firm. My name was written in beautiful calligraphic script. I couldn't understand who would send me an official letter or why. We had no legal affairs, no inheritances or transactions. I opened the envelope with trembling hands, and what I read seemed at first like a prank or a mistake. The letter was from a notary in a neighboring town, informing me of the death of a distant relative on my mother's side, Eleanor Sterling. I had never heard of her, didn't even know she existed, but according to her will, she had left me all her property, and that property was considerable. A house in a prestigious part of town, a plot of land, antique furniture, paintings, jewelry, and most importantly, a bank account with a sum that exceeded all my dreams of wealth. The numbers in the letter seemed unreal. I hadn't seen so much money even in movies. Anna read the letter over my shoulder and I felt her breath quicken. She reread the figures on the bank statement several times as if disbelieving her own eyes. The children were playing in the next room, oblivious that their lives could change drastically in the coming days. I remember Lily laughing at some toy and Alex reading a book lying on the old sofa. The usual sounds of our poor but still happy family. The first few days after receiving the letter passed in a blur. I couldn't believe what was happening, constantly rereading the documents, checking seals and signatures. Was this not a dream? Could our financial problems really be solved in one fell swoop? I was afraid to rejoice too soon, remembering all my previous failures when hope shattered against harsh reality. Sarah and I decided not to tell anyone about the inheritance until we were sure of its authenticity. The next day, I took a day off work and drove to the notary. The office was located downtown, in a beautiful old building which already spoke to the firm's seriousness. The notary, an elderly man with gray whiskers and attentive eyes, confirmed the authenticity of all the documents. Eleanor Sterling was indeed my distant relative on my mother's side, though our families had lost touch many decades ago. She lived alone in a large house on the outskirts of town, never let anyone in, and led a reclusive life. Neighbors considered her strange but harmless. She died in her sleep from a heart attack, and her housekeeper only discovered her body a week later. The notary told me that Eleanor Sterling had meticulously tracked the fates of all her relatives, even the most distant ones. She knew about my financial difficulties, about me having a family and children. In her will, she wrote that she wanted to help a young family struggling with life's hardships. These words touched me deeply, though I never understood how she could have known about our problems. The inheritance process took several weeks, but each day brought us closer to incredible wealth. I continued going to work as if nothing had happened, but inside, everything was bubbling with anticipation. Sarah became more cheerful, although we had agreed not to make premature plans. The children noticed that their parents were less stressed, but they didn't understand why. When all the formalities were settled, we went to see the house for the first time. What I saw exceeded all my expectations. The mansion was located in a prestigious neighborhood surrounded by a tall stone fence and old oak trees. The building's architecture was Gothic. Tall stained glass windows, sharp turrets, carved decorations on the facade. The house looked gloomy but majestic, like a set from an old horror film. Inside, the mansion was even more impressive. High ceilings, a carved wooden staircase leading to the second floor, antique furniture that was worth more than we earned in a year. In the living room hung paintings in gilded frames, and antique clocks ticked with some ominous rhythm. The library was crammed with books in different languages, many of which looked very old and valuable. But what struck me most was Eleanor Sterling's study. The room was decorated in dark tones with a black velvet armchair behind a massive oak desk. On the shelves were strange objects, ancient candlesticks, crystals, some amulets. In the corner stood an old safe, which it turned out was full of jewels and gold coins. Sarah walked through the house with an open mouth, touching the expensive furniture and silk curtains. The children ran through the rooms, admiring all these treasures with delight. Lily was thrilled with the huge bedroom with a canopy bed, and Alex couldn't tear himself away from the library, which had more books than he had seen in his entire life. We moved into the mansion a month later. I quit my job, and for the first time in years, I felt free from financial worries. We bought the children new clothes, toys, and enrolled them in a good private school. Sarah quit the clinic and took care of the house, happily settling into our new life. The first few months in the mansion were like a fairy tale. We bought everything we wanted, traveled, and went to restaurants. The children were happy. They made new friends from wealthy families. Sarah blossomed, engaging in charity and social events. I could finally be proud of myself as a provider for my family, though technically I hadn't done anything to earn it. But gradually I began to notice strange things in our new home. At night there were incomprehensible sounds, floorboards creaking when no one was around, rustling in the walls that couldn't be explained by mice or pipes. Sometimes I felt like someone was watching me from the dark corners of the rooms. Sarah also complained about bad dreams, but we attributed it to the stress of radical life changes. In Eleanor Sterling's study, I often felt an especially unpleasant sensation. The air there seemed heavy, thick, and I found it difficult to breathe. Sometimes, sitting at her desk and sorting through financial documents, I felt someone standing behind me. But when I turned around, there was no one. The books in the library were particularly strange. Many were written in Latin or other dead languages and dedicated to occult sciences. I found entire sections on black magic, summoning spirits, and ancient rituals. Some books looked so old that the pages barely held together. In one of them, written in Gothic script, I found a bookmark on a page describing rituals of enrichment through communication with dark forces. At first, I didn't pay it much mind, thinking it was just a strange hobby of my deceased relative. Many older people are interested in mysticism and esotericism, especially when living alone. But the more time I spent in the house, the stronger the feeling became that something was wrong here. The housekeeper who had worked for Eleanor Sterling for the last few years told me some disturbing stories. The woman claimed that at night she saw the mistress talking to someone in the study, though there were never guests in the house. Sometimes she heard strange voices coming from the basement, which Eleanor Sterling forbade anyone to enter. Several times the housekeeper noticed items appearing in the house that hadn't been there before. strange amulets, black candles, some symbols drawn in chalk on the floor. The mansion's basement was locked with several locks, and I only found the keys to it 6 months after moving in by chance in a secret compartment of the desk. Going down there, I discovered a room that was clearly used for some rituals. Black candles stood around the perimeter of the room, and a complex magic circle with incomprehensible symbols was drawn on the floor. In the center of the circle was a stone altar covered in dark stains that looked like dried blood. On the basement walls hung portraits of people in black robes, their eyes seeming to follow my every move. In the corner was another safe where I found Eleanor Sterling's diaries. Reading them was both terrifying and repulsive. The woman detailed her contacts with dark entities, the rituals she performed to gain wealth and power. From the diaries, I learned that Eleanor Sterling had made a pact with a demonic entity many years ago. In exchange for her soul after death, she received unlimited opportunities for enrichment. Money came to her in various ways: lottery wins, successful investments, sudden inheritances from strangers. But for every blessing, she had to pay by performing abominable tasks for her patron. In the last entries of the diary, Eleanor Sterling wrote that she felt death approaching. The demon demanded that she find a successor, someone who would continue to do its bidding in exchange for wealth. The woman extensively researched her distant relatives and chose me, a desperate man with a family ready to do anything for money. Reading these entries, I felt cold sweat cover my body. Had our wealth really been obtained at such a terrible price? Had I, without knowing it, made a deal with the devil? But at the same time, a part of me refused to believe these delusions. Perhaps Eleanor Sterling was simply a mentally ill woman and her wealth had a perfectly earthly origin. I decided to hide my discovery in the basement from Sarah. Why upset her with mystical horror stories? We were happy. The children were enjoying their new life, and I finally felt like a real man, capable of providing for my family. I hid the diaries in the safe, locked the basement, and never went down there again. But the peace didn't last long. About a year after moving into the mansion on a rainy evening when the children were doing their homework and Sarah was reading in the living room, the doorbell rang. It was strange, as we rarely had uninvited guests, and all our acquaintances usually called in advance. I opened the door and saw a person who made my heart stop in terror. Standing before me was a man of medium height in a black suit. His face was deathly pale with sharp features, and his eyes were completely black, without pupils or irises, like two abysses. When he smiled, I saw that his teeth were too sharp and white, like a predator's. A smell of sulfur and decay emanated from him, making my stomach churn with nausea. He introduced himself as Mr. Black and said he had come to discuss the terms of our collaboration. His voice was quiet, but every word echoed in my bones like the toll of a bell. I wanted to slam the door, to scream, to run away, but I couldn't move. His black eyes hypnotized me, robbing me of my will and ability to resist. Mr. Black walked into the house as if he had been invited, and headed straight for Eleanor Sterling's study. I followed him, feeling like a puppet in someone else's hands. In the study, he sat in the deceased owner's armchair and gestured for me to sit opposite him. His presence filled the room with such a sinister energy that the air became thick and heavy to breathe. Mr. Black began to speak in a low, piercing voice. He told me what I already knew from Eleanor Sterling's diaries, but hearing it from him directly was 1,000 times more terrifying. He explained that the wealth I now possessed wasn't simply given to me. It was payment for future services I would owe him. Eleanor Sterling had been his loyal servant for many years, and now that role was passing to me. When I tried to object, to say that I had never agreed to any deals, Mr. Black merely smirked his predatory smile. He reminded me of how I had sworn to do everything possible for my family's happiness at any cost. Those words, spoken in desperation and hopelessness, turned out to be a spell that bound me to him with invisible chains. I had accepted his gifts, The house, the money, the luxurious life. And now I had to pay. The first task seemed relatively harmless. Mr. Black asked me to find a homeless man living under a bridge on the outskirts of town and hand him a small black pouch. He emphasized that I was not to look inside the pouch or ask the vagrant what was in it. Just hand it over and leave. I wanted to refuse, but when I tried to utter the words of refusal, my tongue seemed to turn to stone. Mr. Black explained that resistance was futile. Our agreement was not made on paper, but in deeper realms of being. If I refused to carry out his orders, my family would lose all their wealth and return to their former poverty. But that wouldn't be the worst of it. He hinted at more serious consequences that could affect the health and lives of my loved ones. The next day, I found the vagrant under the bridge. He was an elderly man with empty, wild eyes and trembling hands. When I handed him the pouch, he snatched it with such greed as if it were a treasure. His fingers, touching the pouch's fabric, trembled even more, and a strange glint appeared in his eyes. He whispered something in an incomprehensible language and hid the pouch under his rags. A week later, I saw a news report that the body of a homeless man had been found under the same bridge. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but I knew it was somehow connected to that pouch. I was seized with horror at the realization that I might have become an accomplice to murder. But when I tried to find Mr. Black to demand an explanation, he appeared in my study himself, as if reading my thoughts. He coldly explained that the vagrant was merely a tool for transferring a certain energy to the right place. His death was inevitable and planned long before our meeting. I hadn't killed him. I had simply played the role of an intermediary in a more complex process that my limited human mind couldn't comprehend. These words brought me no comfort, but Mr. Black made it clear that my remorse should end there. The next assignments came with monthly regularity. Mr. Black appeared in the house suddenly, usually late in the evening when the family was asleep. His presence in the house became a real nightmare for me. I started sleeping poorly, constantly listening for sounds, afraid he might appear at any moment. The tasks became increasingly strange and disturbing. He asked me to buy specific items from antique shops, old mirrors, figurines, jewelry. All these things had something in common. They radiated coldness and gave me an unpleasant feeling when touched. Mr. Black would take them and disappear without explaining their purpose. One day, he asked me to find a specific person, a young woman named Maria, who worked at the city library. I was to hand her an ancient leather-bound book that Mr. Black had given me with strict instructions not to open it. The book was heavy and warm to the touch, as if alive, and its cover was covered with symbols that painfully strained my eyes when examined for too long. Maria turned out to be a young, beautiful girl with kind eyes. When I handed her the book, she looked at me with gratitude, unaware of the terrible burden I was placing on her shoulders. A month later, I learned that she had taken her own life, jumping from the roof of her home. Neighbors said that for the past few weeks she had been acting very strangely, not sleeping at night, muttering incomprehensibly, and the lights in her apartment were constantly on. It was then that I realized I had become not just an executor of strange orders, but an active participant in the destruction of human lives. Each of Mr. Black's assignments led to tragedy, illness, death, insanity of innocent people. I tried to find some logic in it, to understand the ultimate goal of all these actions, but my mind refused to accept the reality of what was happening. Sarah began to notice that something was wrong with me. I became nervous, irritable, and often left the house on unexplained errands. At night, she heard me talking to someone in the study, though I hadn't invited anyone there. When she asked who I was talking to, I replied that I was just reading aloud or rehearsing a speech for a business meeting. The children also felt that something was amiss in the house. Lily started to be afraid of the dark and refused to sleep alone in her room. Alex became withdrawn and often asked why the house had become so cold, even though the heating was working fine. Sometimes the children complained of frightening dreams in which they saw dark figures wandering through the corridors of our house. I understood that Mr. Black's presence was affecting the entire family, but I didn't know how to stop it. Every time I tried to refuse his orders, he reminded me of the price of our wealth. He showed me visions of our past, our miserable apartment, our hungry children, a despairing Sarah. These images were so realistic that I physically felt the cold of that old apartment, the smell of dampness and hopelessness. Mr. Black explained to me that we lived in a fragile balance between worlds. Our wealth was sustained by the energy he received from my assignments. Every suffering, every death, every ruined life fed the dark forces that provided us with a luxurious life. If this flow of energy stopped, we wouldn't just lose money, we could lose much more. But the worst began when Mr. Black demanded that I do something that involved not strangers, but my own family. It happened on a cold December evening when the children were already asleep and Sarah had gone to a friend's. Mr. Black appeared in the study and sat in his usual armchair. His black eyes glowed with an ominous glint in the dim light of the room. He explained that a new stage of our cooperation had begun. Simple tasks were no longer enough to maintain the level of wealth we had grown accustomed to. The dark forces demanded more significant sacrifices, more personal losses. He asked me to bring him a strand of my daughter Lily's hair and a drop of her blood. When I tried to protest, to say that I would never harm my children, Mr. Black laughed a quiet, chilling laugh. He reminded me that my family already belonged to him. Every day spent in this house, every dollar spent bound them more closely to the dark forces he served. The hair and blood weren't needed to harm Lily immediately, but to create a magical connection that would be needed in the future. He explained that children were especially valuable to the dark forces because their souls were still pure and full of life energy. Through this connection, he could gradually drain Lily's life force, and in return, our family would receive even more wealth and power. The process would be slow and imperceptible. The girl would simply become weaker and more sickly until she faded completely. I refused. For the first time since we met, I firmly told Mr. Black no. I was ready to lose all the money, to return to poverty, to work 3 jobs, but I would not let him touch my children. In response to my refusal, his face contorted into a grimace of fury and the smell of sulfur and decay filled the air. Mr. Black warned me that my resistance was futile. The connection between our families was already created through Eleanor Sterling's inheritance. If I didn't fulfill his demand voluntarily, he would find a way to get what he wanted by force. And then the consequences for my family would be much worse than if I had cooperated with him willingly. That night, after he left, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house, checking the locks on doors and windows, although I knew that ordinary locks wouldn't stop an entity like Mr. Black. When Sarah returned home, I hugged her so tightly that she was surprised by my behavior. I wanted to tell her everything, but I knew she would think I was crazy. The next morning, I found that someone had been in Lily's room during the night. On her pillow lay a strand of light hair, and on the sheet I noticed a small dark stain that looked like dried blood. The girl was sleeping peacefully and remembered nothing, but there was a tiny scratch on her cheek that hadn't been there yesterday. Mr. Black had gotten what he wanted despite my refusal. This fact finally convinced me that I was dealing with forces far beyond my ability to resist. But the worst was yet to come. I began to notice that Lily was indeed becoming more sluggish and sickly. She complained more often of headaches, tired quickly, and her appetite worsened. Sarah became worried and insisted on taking our daughter to the doctors. Examinations revealed no illnesses. All tests were normal, but Lily continued to weaken. The doctors were baffled, suggesting psychological problems or a rare disease that was difficult to diagnose. I understood the true cause of my daughter's illness, but I was powerless to change anything. Every night I heard Mr. Black roaming the house, and I knew he was continuing his grim work. Sometimes I saw his dark figure in the hallway, leaning over Lily's sleeping bed. When I tried to approach, he vanished like smoke. Alex also began to change, although his changes were of a different kind. The boy became more aggressive, often got into fights at school and talked back to his parents. Sometimes I noticed a strange glint in his eyes that reminded me of Mr. Black's gaze. Sarah considered these teenage problems, but I saw something more sinister in my son's behavior. One night I woke up to the sound of conversation in the children's room. Creeping to the door, I heard Alex quietly talking to someone. At first, I thought he was talking to himself or his toys, but then I realized there was indeed someone else in the room. The interlocutor's voice was low and hoarse, and in it I recognized Mr. Black's intonations. I burst into the room but found only Alex sitting on the bed with a vacant stare. When I asked him who he was talking to, the boy looked at me with incomprehension and said that no one was there. But the familiar smell of sulfur still lingered in the air, and on the window I noticed a handprint that was too large to belong to a child. It was then that I realized Mr. Black had begun working not only with Lily but with Alex as well. He was gradually corrupting my son's soul, preparing him to be a new servant. The boy became more cruel and indifferent to the suffering of others. One day, I caught him in the garden, systematically tearing the wings off a live butterfly, watching its torment with scientific interest. Sarah grew increasingly worried about the children's condition, but I couldn't explain the true reason for what was happening. Every time I tried to tell her the truth, the words stuck in my throat, as if an invisible hand was squeezing my windpipe. Mr. Black had cast a spell of silence on me, preventing me from revealing the secret of our pact. I tried to find a way to break the connection with the dark forces, studying books from Eleanor Sterling's library, searching for information online. But all sources said the same thing. A deal with a demon could only be broken under exceptional circumstances, and the price of such liberation always exceeded the benefits received. Lily continued to weaken with each passing day. The girl who had once been full of energy and laughter had become a pale shadow of herself. She lay in bed for hours, complaining of fatigue, and her once bright eyes had dulled and sunken. Doctors still couldn't make a diagnosis, offering more and more tests and analyses that showed nothing. Alex, on the other hand, became increasingly active, but his activity was destructive. He began to torment the pets we had acquired after moving into the mansion. First, Lily's hamster disappeared. We found it dead in the garden with strange cuts on its body. Then the cat went missing, and a few days later the gardener found its remains in the basement, arranged in some kind of ritualistic symbol. When I tried to talk to Alex about what was happening, he looked at me with eyes that held nothing childlike. His gaze held an ancient malice and cold cruelty that could not belong to an 8-year-old child. He told me that the animals had been sacrificed to strengthen our well-being, and that soon more significant sacrifices would be needed. Sarah noticed my deteriorating mental state and insisted that I see a psychologist. But how could I explain to a professional that my house was inhabited by a demon who was turning my children into monsters? How could I tell them that every night I heard the whispers of dark forces demanding more and more sacrifices? Mr. Black appeared in my study more and more often, sometimes several times a week. His demands became increasingly perverse and cruel. He forced me to find people with specific characteristics. Young mothers, lonely elderly people, children from troubled families. A terrible fate awaited each of them, and I was the conduit for that fate. One day he ordered me to find a pregnant woman and give her a special amulet that was supposed to protect her unborn child. I found such a woman at the prenatal clinic, a young girl who was expecting her first child and glowed with happiness. When I gave her the amulet, saying it was a gift from an anonymous benefactor, she smiled at me with such gratitude that it physically pained me to realize what I was doing. A month later, I learned from the news that this woman had given birth to a stillborn child under strange circumstances. Doctors couldn't explain the cause of death. The fetus had been healthy until birth but was born dead, with blackened skin and an expression of horror on its tiny face. The amulet had disappeared from her belongings as if it had vanished into thin air. I realized that I was gradually turning into an instrument of evil, a conduit for death and suffering. Each completed task made me more callous and indifferent to human suffering. Sometimes I caught myself feeling a strange satisfaction, seeing the results of my actions in the news reports. Sarah began to suspect that something supernatural was happening to our family. She found strange objects in the house. Black candles that no one had bought, symbols drawn in chalk on the basement walls, traces of blood on the study floor. When she asked me about it, I replied that I knew nothing, but I saw growing fear and distrust in her eyes. One night, Sarah followed me and saw me talking to Mr. Black in the study. She couldn't see him. To her, the armchair was empty and I was talking to thin air. The next day, she tried to convince me to see a psychiatrist, claiming that I was having hallucinations and needed help. Mr. Black learned of Sarah's suspicions and threatened me with serious consequences if she continued to interfere in our affairs. He said that my wife was becoming an obstacle to our plans and that something needed to be done about this obstacle. His words sounded like a death sentence, and I realized that Sarah was in mortal danger. Over the next few days, I watched as my wife's health began to deteriorate. She complained of constant headaches. She developed insomnia, and her appetite completely disappeared. At night, she tossed and turned in bed, muttering something in her sleep in an incomprehensible language. Sometimes I heard her talking to someone in the empty rooms of the house. Lily, meanwhile, continued to fade. The girl barely got out of bed. Her skin became waxy and translucent, and her breathing shallow and intermittent. Doctors suggested hospitalization, but all their efforts were useless against the supernatural illness that was devouring my daughter's life force. Alex became increasingly strange and frightening. He began to say things that an 8-year-old child couldn't know, about death, about dark rituals, about forces that ruled the world from the shadows. One day, I found him in the basement, where he was drawing complex magical symbols on the floor with his own blood. When I asked him where he learned these signs, the boy replied that his night teacher taught them to him. The culmination came on New Year's Eve. Mr. Black appeared to me with a final task that was meant to complete my transformation into his full-fledged servant. He demanded that I sacrifice my own family. Only then would I receive true power and wealth that would surpass all my previous dreams. He explained that the souls of my loved ones, bound to me by blood ties, held special value for the dark forces. Their death at my hands would create such a powerful flow of negative energy that it would secure my place among the highest servants of evil. I would become immortal, omnipotent, capable of fulfilling any desire. When I refused, Mr. Black laughed and showed me a vision of the future. I saw Lily dying in a hospital room from an unknown illness, Sarah going insane with grief and committing suicide, Alex turning into a cruel murderer who would spend his life in prison. All of this would happen if I didn't fulfill his last demand, but if I agreed to his offer, their suffering would end quickly and painlessly, and their souls would find peace in his realm. Mr. Black presented this as an act of mercy, freeing my family from a tormenting agony that would stretch on for years. That night I didn't sleep, agonizing over the choice between two terrible options. On one hand, I couldn't raise a hand against my loved ones, the people I loved more than life itself. On the other hand, Mr. Black's vision showed me that an even worse fate awaited them if I refused. By morning, I had made my decision. I couldn't bear to watch my family suffer any longer. Couldn't see them slowly dying from the influence of dark forces. If their death was inevitable, then let it be quick and at the hand of someone who loved them, rather than long and agonizing. Mr. Black gave me a special dagger with a black blade covered in ancient runes. He explained that this weapon would ensure a painless death and guarantee that the souls of my loved ones would enter his domain, where they would be protected from the sufferings of the earthly world. I started with Lily. The girl was sleeping in her bed, exhausted by illness, her breathing barely audible. When I leaned over her with the dagger, she opened her eyes and looked at me with such trust and love that my heart tore apart. She whispered, "Daddy, it hurts so much. Help me." And I knew I was doing it out of love for her. The blow was precise and swift. Lily didn't even have time to be afraid. She simply closed her eyes and her suffering ended. Her small body went limp in my arms and her face found a peace it hadn't known for months. I kissed her forehead and felt something forever die in my soul. Alex was harder. When I entered his room, the boy was already awake. He sat on the bed and looked at me with eyes full of inhuman understanding. "I knew you would come," he said in a voice that held nothing childlike. "The night teacher told me it had to be this way." He didn't resist when I approached with the dagger. Moreover, he extended his hand, as if helping me find the right place for the blow. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered before he died. "Now I can serve the teacher forever." These words horrified me more than the act of murder itself. I realized that my son's soul had already been lost long before his physical death. Sarah was the hardest. She woke up when I entered our bedroom. Seeing the dagger in my hands and blood on my clothes, she immediately understood what had happened. But instead of screaming or trying to run, she simply looked at me with infinite sadness. "You killed our children," she said quietly. And there was no horror or accusation in her voice, only boundless sorrow. I knew something would happen. In recent months, I saw how you were changing, how darkness was consuming you. But I tried to explain to her that I had no choice, that I was doing this to spare them from worse torments. But the words sounded false even to myself. Sarah shook her head and closed her eyes. "Do what you must," she whispered. "But know that you are not just killing our bodies. You are killing all the good that was in you, all the love we shared. After this, you will no longer be human." Her death was the most painful for me. When the dagger pierced her heart, I felt my ability to love, to feel, to be human leave me along with her life. In that second, I understood that Mr. Black had deceived me. I hadn't saved my family from suffering. I had simply become the instrument of their destruction. After it was all over, Mr. Black appeared in the house. He looked more real and tangible than before, as if the death of my loved ones had given him additional power. He congratulated me on successfully completing the task and promised that now unlimited wealth and power would be available to me. But I no longer wanted wealth or power. I wanted only one thing: for all of this to be a nightmare, for me to wake up and see my family alive and well. Mr. Black laughed at my words and said that regret was a luxury I could no longer afford. He explained to me that now I was bound to him forever. My soul belonged to him, and the bodies of my family would become conduits for other demonic entities. Death was only the beginning of their torment, not the end. In the realm of darkness, they would be used for the most abominable purposes, and I would watch, unable to intervene. It was then that the last human feeling awakened in me: rage. I grabbed the dagger with which I had killed my family and tried to plunge it into Mr. Black. But the blade passed through his body as if through smoke. He only laughed and said that physical weapons were powerless against beings like him. But at that moment, I remembered something from Eleanor Sterling's books. A dagger with which a sacrifice was made out of love, however twisted, could be turned against its creator if the one holding it was willing to sacrifice their own soul. I turned the blade towards my heart and uttered the words of a spell I had once read in one of the ancient books. Mr. Black understood my intentions and tried to stop me, but it was too late. The dagger pierced my chest and I felt the cold steel touch my heart. At the same moment, Mr. Black's dark figure began to dissolve and his screams of rage filled the house. The spell worked, but not as I had hoped. Yes, I broke the connection with the demon and deprived him of some of the power he gained from my family's death. But the souls of my loved ones were not freed. They were already too deeply entangled in the nets of darkness. I only ensured that their torment would not last forever, but would end after a certain time. dying on the floor of my cursed mansion, I saw the ghosts of Sarah, Lily, and Alex. They stood beside me, but their faces were cold and alien. Sarah shook her head and said, "You thought you were saving us, but you only made it worse. Now we are stuck between worlds, neither living nor dead." The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the sound of police sirens. One of the neighbors heard screams and called the police. I was found bleeding next to the bodies of my family with a dagger in my chest. Doctors said it was a miracle I survived. The dagger passed within millimeters of my heart, missing vital organs. But I knew it was no miracle, it was a curse. Mr. Black left me alive so I could bear the burden of guilt for murdering my family for the rest of my days. That's why I'm sitting in this office now telling you this story, Detective Miller. I know you won't believe in supernatural forces and demons and magical pacts. To you, I'm just a mentally ill person who killed his family in a fit of madness. And perhaps you're right. Perhaps all these visions were the fruit of my sick imagination, and Mr. Black was a hallucination born of guilt and despair. But then how do you explain what's happening to me now? Every night in my cell, I see the ghosts of my loved ones. They stand at my feet and look at me with silent reproach. Sometimes I hear Lily's laughter, which turns into crying, or Alex's voice calling me from the darkness. Sarah often tries to say something, but her words get lost in the noise that fills my head. The mansion where we lived burned down the day after my arrest. The fire started on its own, for no apparent reason, and destroyed the building to ashes. Firefighters said they had never seen fire of such a black color. Eleanor Sterling's library, the basement with ritual symbols, the study where I met Mr. Black, everything turned to ash. But I know this isn't the end. The evil that settled in that house didn't die with it. It's just looking for a new victim, a new desperate person ready to trade their soul for money. Perhaps right now someone is receiving a letter about an unexpected inheritance and a new cycle of suffering is about to begin. I will be sentenced to life imprisonment or to death. I don't know and don't particularly care. The punishment the court gives me is nothing compared to what I already carry in my soul. Every day and every night I will remember the last minutes of my loved ones' lives, their trusting eyes, their last words. The only thing I pray for is that my story serves as a warning to others. Never sacrifice your principles for money. Never think that wealth can solve all problems. And if you are ever offered an easy way to get rich, run away as far as you can. Because the true price of such wealth always exceeds its value, and you will have to pay for it not with money but with human souls. I finished my story. Detective Miller turned off the recorder and looked at me silently for a long time. In his eyes I saw a mixture of disgust, pity, and disbelief. He didn't believe my story. To him, I remained an ordinary murderer trying to shift the blame onto mystical forces. But that no longer matters. What matters is that the story has been told, and perhaps someone reading the transcript of my testimony will understand the true essence of the warning. Perhaps someone will avoid my fate and save their family. And I will await my sentence and hope that someday I can reunite with my loved ones and ask for their forgiveness, although I know that some sins are never forgiven.